The pharaoh wakes barefoot. The palace was quiet. At this early hour, long before the sun stretched itself over the horizon, silence lay heavy on the stone halls. The air inside was cool, holding on to the last breath of night, while the sands beyond the palace walls still glimmered faintly under the fading stars. Within his chamber, the pharaoh stirred from sleep. He was not simply a ruler, not merely a god among men this morning. He was a man searching for something very ordinary. He reached for the floor with a slow movement, expecting to feel the familiar touch of his sandals. They were always there, waiting neatly at his bedside, prepared by careful servants the evening before. Yet today his toes met nothing but the smooth, cool surface of polished stone. The sandals, those small companions of his daily life, were gone. The pharaoh frowned. It was not the kind of frown that shook kingdoms or sent scribes rushing to record a decree. It was the quiet, puzzled frown of someone who has misplaced a very personal item. For sandals, though simple, carried meaning in Egypt. They were more than a means of protecting the feet from scorching sand. They were symbols of order and readiness, of dignity and daily routine. Sandals followed the pharaoh wherever he went, through processions beneath painted colonnades, across temple courtyards, shimmering with incense smoke, even into the symbolic realm of afterlife. For it was believed no pharaoh should enter eternity barefoot. Sandals were placed carefully in tombs, stitched of reeds or leather, sometimes even adorned with gold, to ensure that the king would walk with grace forever. And yet here in the quiet chamber, the living pharaoh sat barefoot. The absence of his sandals seemed almost absurd, a small rebellion of daily life in a world built on ritual and perfection. Without them, he felt strangely vulnerable, as though his authority had been ever so slightly unfastened. He rose and padded softly across the floor, his bare steps echoing more loudly than he liked. He thought of the sound sandals usually made, a gentle slap of leather against skin, a rhythm that followed him like a heartbeat wherever he walked. It was a sound of presence, of composure. Now only the whisper of his skin against stone accompanied him. He wondered in a moment of wry humor whether even great kings must endure the small frustrations of missing belongings. Perhaps he thought the builders of pyramids could raise stone blocks higher than any man had ever dared, but even they could not prevent a pharaoh from losing his shoes. In truth, sandals were not always guaranteed. Common Egyptians sometimes walked barefoot, especially in fields and farms, saving their sandals for special occasions. Soldiers relied on them during long marches, priests removed them in reverence when entering holy places, and children outgrew theirs as quickly as any child does. The pharaoh, however, had many pairs crafted from fine leather or woven reeds with straps carefully cut and knotted. Each pair was both ordinary and symbolic. Ordinary because they were worn every day, symbolic because they carried the weight of tradition, dignity, and belief. Standing barefoot in the quiet room, the pharaoh let his thoughts wander. Had a servant forgotten them? Had they been misplaced in a corner? Or perhaps the sandals themselves had grown weary of their duties and chosen to slip away, longing for a rest of their own. It was a foolish idea, but in the stillness of morning, foolish thoughts can walk freely just as easily as kings. Beyond the chamber doors, the palace was waking. Servants shuffled softly, preparing trays, mixing scented oils, lighting lamps to replace the stars. Soon the pharaoh would be expected to appear in order, robed and adorned, each detail reflecting not only his personal dignity, but the harmony of the kingdom itself. Yet for now he lingered in this small mystery, a pharaoh, a king of Upper and Lower Egypt, standing barefoot on cool stone, missing his sandals. There was a strange comfort in the thought. The absence of sandals made him just for a moment less of a symbol and more of a man who knew the feel of the floor beneath him, who remembered that power was built not only on gold armies and temples, but also on the humbler things of life, bread, water, and yes, even a pair of shoes. As dawn's first light slipped quietly into the chamber, stretching long beams of pale gold across the walls, the pharaoh smiled faintly at the thought. His sandals, wherever they had gone, could wait a little longer. For now the morning was enough, and the quiet was a gift. And so began the day of the pharaoh who woke barefoot. The palace without sandals. The pharaoh awoke that morning not to the familiar soft slap of sandals on polished stone, but to the faint shuffle of bare feet against the cool floor. His toes curled against the smooth limestone tiles, and for a brief, bewildered moment, He wondered if perhaps he was still dreaming. A pharaoh barefoot in his own palace. It seemed a curious thought, almost like one of those small riddles the scribes liked to compose to pass time on long afternoons. The chamber itself was quiet, as such places often are in the earliest light of the day. A curtain of woven reeds trembled slightly with the desert breeze. Beyond the carved pillars, servants moved with hushed steps, carrying jars of water and baskets of bread. None dared glance directly at the pharaoh as he stepped forward, bare feet, making almost no sound, as if he were simply drifting across the floor like a spirit. Normally the day began with ceremony. Attendants would kneel with sandals at the ready, slip them onto the royal feet, and so the pharaoh's presence would be announced with every step. The sandals spoke before he did. They declared authority as they clapped rhythmically through the corridors. But today, silence followed him. He looked to one side, then the other. No sandals at the foot of the bed, none neatly placed by the throne chair where he sometimes sat to receive petitions, not even tucked away beneath a folding stool or waiting upon a lacquered tray. There was only emptiness and his own puzzled expression. The chief steward entered, bowing low. He did not at first notice the pharaoh's bare feet, so focused was he on his carefully rehearsed greetings. But as the pharaoh shifted, the steward's eyes widened, darting quickly down, and his voice caught in his throat. "My lord, your sandals—" "Yes," the pharaoh replied with the mild patience of one who had already considered this fact at some length. "They appear to have wandered." The steward paled as though sandals might sprout legs and march away in protest. He stammered, "We shall find them at once, O mighty one. Perhaps they are in the treasury, or in the washing basins, or—" His voice grew softer with each increasingly unlikely suggestion. Soon a flurry of motion stirred the palace. Servants hurried to and fro, checking corners where sandals had no business being, the kitchens, where onions and garlic scented the air, the scribal chamber littered with papyrus rolls, even the gardens where lotus flowers floated serenely in pools. Each time they returned shaking their heads, the mystery only deepened. Meanwhile, the pharaoh continued his walk through the palace, quiet and unhurried. Each chamber held its own rhythm, the whisper of servants' feet, the scrape of pottery, the rustle of linen garments. Without the firm clap of sandals, he seemed less like a ruler and more like a silent observer in his own house. At one doorway he paused. The floor here was rougher, small flecks of grit pressing against his soul. He thought of farmers in the fields who trod barefoot upon earth and mud every day, sandals reserved for festivals if they owned any at all. The pharaoh, in that small discomfort, felt a peculiar closeness to them. To walk barefoot was to remember what it meant to stand directly upon the land itself, without distance, without leather as a shield. He wandered past painted walls where gods strode with eternal sandals upon their feet. Horus, falcon-headed with elegant straps drawn firmly across his instep. Hathor, with her horned crown poised, as though even divinity required footwear to cross the heavens. Could it be that gods never misplaced their sandals? Or perhaps, he wondered with a quiet smile, priests simply painted them back into place whenever they risked being forgotten. The steward returned again, this time leading a small procession of worried faces, a sandal-bearer wringing his hands, a chambermaid clutching a broom, even a palace guard still in half-polished armor. All bowed low and awaited instruction. "Have you found them?" the pharaoh asked gently. "No, my lord," the steward admitted, voice nearly breaking, "but we are widening the search. Every chamber, every chest, even the laundry heaps." "Very well," the pharaoh replied. He did not sound angry, only mildly amused, as though the whole affair were some cosmic joke played upon the palace. And so the pharaoh walked on, padding through colonnades where sunlight striped the stone like golden ribbons. Birds called from the eaves. Cats stretched lazily across the thresholds, watching him with the disinterested gaze only cats possess. Perhaps even they wondered what had become of those sandals. By midday, the palace had grown restless. Whispers passed along corridors. The pharaoh walks barefoot. Some found the idea humorous, others unsettling. For if the pharaoh's sandals could be lost, what else in the world might slip quietly out of place? Yet for the pharaoh himself, the absence of sandals was less calamity than curiosity. He sat at last upon a low bench in the garden, toes brushing the warm sand. Attendants clustered nervously nearby, still debating possibilities, but he merely breathed in the quiet air, considering how peculiar and human a thing it was to lose a pair of shoes. In that small pause, the grand machinery of kingship, the rituals, the speeches, the judgments seemed to wait patiently. For once, the pharaoh was simply a man without sandals enjoying the garden breeze. And somewhere hidden in shadow or misplaced by careless hands, those sandals lay waiting, their mystery deepening with every passing hour. The cobblers of the palace. The sandals of the pharaoh had still not appeared by the third morning. The sun, patient as ever, climbed over the horizon, spilling gold into the courtyards of the palace. Yet down in the chambers where servants whispered and scribes shuffled their papyrus rolls, the talk was not of treaties or tributes, but of sandals. The vizier, who usually worried about grain storage and taxation, found himself drafting lists of craftsmen. Summon the cobblers, he sighed, as if ordering a council of generals. Bring the sandal makers from every corner of Memphis, from the workshops along the river and the stalls near the temple gates. So into the grand halls of the palace came men who rarely saw them, the cobblers of Egypt. They arrived with bundles of leather jars of glue and hands darkened with work. Some looked nervous, for they had never before spoken directly to Pharaoh. Others looked eager, sensing that their humble trade was now momentarily raised to the highest stage in the land. The pharaoh himself greeted them with a calm smile. He did not scold, nor did he frown at his bare feet. Instead, he walked softly across the cool tiles and said, "Tell me about sandals." The cobblers blinked, unsure if this was a question or a command. One, braver than the rest, cleared his throat. Great pharaoh sandals are cut from cowhide, softened in water, stretched on wooden frames. The straps are bound by thong or cord, sometimes linen, sometimes reed. A good sandal bends with the foot but does not crack. A poor sandal. He trailed off, realizing he was speaking to a man who owned pairs gilded in gold. But Pharaoh only nodded, as if he enjoyed the detail. "And what makes a sandal fit well?" he asked. The cobbler warmed to his subject. "It must be cut for the foot alone. The heel must rest snug, the toes must not slip beyond the edge. A sandal too large is worse than none, it trips the wearer. A sandal too small pinches until the journey feels longer than the Nile itself." Pharaoh laughed gently, and the courtiers stiffened. But it was no harsh laugh, only a warm ripple like water against a boat. "Then perhaps it is true," he said, "that a sandal teaches us balance. Too large and we stumble, too small and we suffer. Only when it fits does the path become smooth." The cobblers bowed, bewildered, for their pharaoh had turned leatherwork into philosophy. Others were invited to speak. One brought a sandal stitched with lotus motifs, explaining how symbols please not just the eye, but the gods. Another described sandals made of papyrus reed, light and cool, though they wore down quickly. "They are like summer clouds," he said, "shyly beautiful but fleeting." Pharaoh nodded, finding poetry in the craftsman's words. A third spoke of sandals made for burial, crafted to last in the tomb, never worn in life, but placed beside the body so the soul could walk in the field of reeds. "We do not make them for steps in this world, Majesty," he said, "but for steps in eternity." At that, the hall grew quiet. Even the sandals on Pharaoh's feet, missing though they were, seemed less urgent when compared to the sandals of the afterlife. The scribes, meanwhile, scribbled furiously, not wanting to lose a single phrase. It was possible, they thought, that Pharaoh's sandals would be remembered not for being lost, but for inspiring a new treatise, the Meditations on Footwear. One cobbler, bolder than the rest, asked if he might examine Pharaoh's bare foot. The court gasped, but Pharaoh stretched out his leg calmly. The cobbler studied it as though it were a map. "High arch, broad toes," he murmured. "Majesty walks with strength. No wonder the straps must be firm, or they would slip." Pharaoh smiled again. "And what does that tell you about me?" The cobbler hesitated, then said that Majesty was born not only to sit upon a throne, but to walk upon the earth. A murmur went through the hall. It was simple yet profound. The pharaoh, often likened to the sun, eternal and untouchable, was here recognized as a man with feet broad, strong, and capable of dust. After the speeches and the examinations, the cobblers were permitted to set up their tools in a shaded colonnade. They shaped new sandals in every style they knew: leather-dyed red papyrus woven with reeds, soft linen cords for comfort. One pair was even studded with tiny beads of faience, though it seemed far too delicate for daily wear. Pharaoh watched them work. The sound of knives trimming hid the smell of leather soaked and softened the sight of hands practiced from years of repetition. All of it filled the morning with a quiet industry. It was not the sound of battle or worship, but something gentler, almost domestic. At last, the sandals were laid before him in rows. Pharaoh tried a pair of reed sandals, too flimsy. He tried the beaded pair, too fragile. He tried a strong leather pair with lotus stitching, and for a while he walked about the hall, his steps echoing softly. "Comfortable," he said at last, "but they are not the ones I seek." The court stirred uneasily, but Pharaoh only raised a hand. "It is no fault of yours. These are fine sandals, yet the ones I lost, they were old, worn at the edges. They had walked with me many mornings. New sandals, though beautiful, cannot carry the memory of old ones." The cobblers bowed, their pride tempered by understanding. That evening, when the artisans left the palace, they carried with them more than wages. They carried stories. One told his apprentices the Pharaoh spoke of balance. Another said, "He reminded me that even sandals for eternity are still sandals shaped by hand." A third whispered, "He let me touch his foot." They laughed at that, but gently, as men do when laughter comes from reverence rather than mockery. And Pharaoh, walking barefoot once more across the cool stone, was not troubled. His missing sandals had already begun to multiply into meanings. Each craftsman had offered not just a pair of shoes, but a reflection, and Pharaoh found himself strangely content. For a moment, the absence of his sandals seemed less like a loss and more like a small gift, the chance for men who bent over leather all their lives to stand tall and speak before their king. The sandals, wherever they were, remained hidden, but the search had uncovered something else: the dignity of small crafts, the wisdom of ordinary hands, the poetry hidden in simple souls. And so the day ended, not with sandals found, but with sandals remembered. The sandals of the gods. Morning in the palace began not with fanfare, but with the steady rhythm of priests and attendants making their way toward the temple courts. The pharaoh, still barefoot, followed quietly, curious to see if his missing sandals might appear somewhere among the sacred rituals of the day. If sandals could vanish in the hush of dawn, perhaps they had not been misplaced at all. Perhaps they had been called elsewhere. The temples of Egypt were not merely houses of worship, they were the very engines of the kingdom, and within them every object, every gesture, every sound carried weight. A sandal, after all, was not only a piece of leather to keep a royal soul from the dust, it was a symbol. To wear sandals in the temple was to show one's readiness to walk upon holy ground. To remove them was to show humility before the gods. Priests often entered barefoot, their feet washed in sacred water, their steps deliberate upon the cool flagstones. Pharaoh, however, embodied both roles: the human who must honor the gods and the god-king who must stand above mortals. So when Pharaoh entered the temple barefoot, it was noticed. Not condemned, not mocked, noticed. Like the sudden pause of a harpist mid-song. The priests exchanged glances but said nothing. For in Egypt, silence was often the highest form of reverence. One priest, older than the rest, approached with measured steps. He had seen many kings, many sandals, golden, reed-woven, bejeweled, simple. Bowing, he whispered, "Great Pharaoh, even the gods are sometimes barefoot. Ra crosses the heavens without shoes. Osiris rests in the underworld with no leather upon his feet. What is lost may be a sign of what is sacred." Pharaoh smiled faintly. "Perhaps the gods have borrowed my sandals," he said. His voice was calm, tinged with amusement. It was not a jest, not entirely, for in Egypt such things were possible. The morning ceremony continued. Incense curled upward like delicate ropes of smoke, carrying prayers to the unseen. Hymns echoed in the high columns, a sound both grand and strangely intimate, like a lullaby sung by stone itself. Pharaoh watched as the priests lifted offerings, bread, beer, onions, figs, and placed them before the statues of the gods. These offerings, too, had their meaning. They were sustenance symbols, contracts. One gave to the gods, so the gods would give in return. And Pharaoh thought, are sandals not also an offering? Shoes touch the earth, which is sacred. Shoes carry the body, which is divine. To lose them is perhaps to share them with the unseen. As the rituals unfolded, a scribe unrolled a papyrus and began to chant verses. Among them was a line Pharaoh had heard before, but never noticed until now. To tread upon enemies is victory. To tread upon earth is balance. To walk barefoot is truth. The word struck him gently like water over stone. To walk barefoot is truth. Perhaps then the absence of sandals was not an error but a lesson. Meanwhile, outside the temple attendants still searched. They looked under couches, in storerooms, even among baskets of offerings brought by villagers. One boy claimed he saw sandals by the Nile carried off by a fisherman who thought them abandoned. Another swore the sandals had been taken by a cat, those sly guardians of both palace and temple. Rumors multiplied like reeds along the river. Yet Pharaoh within the temple felt no urgency. Barefoot he felt the smooth stone beneath him cool and grounding. He imagined the sandals in whatever place they now resided, perhaps in a shrine, perhaps on a fisherman's boat, perhaps already in the company of the gods. The priests, sensing this calm, began to weave sandals into their prayers. They spoke of the Pharaoh's feet as instruments of balance, of sandals as bridges between the mortal dust and the eternal path. They recited how sandals were placed in tombs so the dead might walk in the afterlife. Even Tutankhamun, the boy king, had been buried with golden sandals to guide him beyond death's horizon. To go unshod in life was an inconvenience. To go unshod in eternity would be unthinkable. Yet here Pharaoh was alive, barefoot, smiling softly in the temple's shadowed light. The ceremony ended with the clatter of sistrums, the rattle of beads that sounded like rain on stone. The priests withdrew, leaving Pharaoh seated on a low dais. He remained a while looking at his bare feet resting on the temple floor. The soles were strong, though accustomed more to polished marble than to earth or sand. He wiggled his toes slightly, an almost boyish gesture, and thought, perhaps the gods wished me to remember that even kings are human. When he left the temple, the city was already alive with the midday sun. Children splashed near canals, merchants called out prices for fish, and beer donkeys brayed under loads of onions and papyrus. Many walked barefoot not by choice, but by life's simple necessity. Pharaoh saw them and felt not pity but kinship. He too walked the same earth, soul against soil. For the first time in years, perhaps, he felt what they felt, the warmth of the stone, the tickle of dust, the humility of naked feet. That evening, when the palace scribes recorded the day's events, they noted Pharaoh walked barefoot among the gods. No sandals were seen, nothing more, nothing less. For in Egypt, a missing sandal could be a story, or it could be a mystery, or it could be a truth too quiet to name. And Pharaoh thought, as he drifted towards sleep, if the gods wear my sandals tonight, may they walk gently. May they remember to return them or not, for I have found the ground beneath my feet, and that may be enough. The sandals of the gods' morning passed, and with it the restless searching of attendants who combed corners of the palace for any trace of the pharaoh's sandals. Yet the sandals did not appear. They seemed to have slipped not merely from sight, but from the very rhythm of the day. By midday, the pharaoh was due to walk to the temple, a procession that usually gleamed with order and ceremony. Priests stood ready at the gates, incense rising in coils that shimmered against the brightness of the sky. Normally, the pharaoh's sandals clicked softly on the stone with each step, their sound deliberate, reassuring. Today there was only the sound of skin against stone, bare soles greeting the palace floor as if nothing at all were amiss. The priests exchanged uncertain glances. Sandals in Egypt were not only clothing, they were protection symbols, boundaries between dust and holiness. To be barefoot was both humbling and perhaps in its own way sacred. The pharaoh paused at the temple threshold. It was said that even the gods themselves wore sandals, delicate gold ones for Ra, simple reed ones for Osiris, lion-headed pairs for Sekhmet. Carved reliefs in the temple walls showed them clearly, gods striding with feet both divine and shod. To be without sandals then was unusual. Yet it was also true that some rituals required bare feet for purity, for closeness to the earth. The high priest bowed deeply. His voice, cautious yet gentle, carried through the pillared hall. Great one, perhaps this is a sign. To come barefoot is to come as all men do. Even a pharaoh like the farmer touches the earth. The pharaoh did not answer at once. He stood still, the cool stone beneath his toes, and watched the incense curl upward. Somewhere in that curling smoke, he imagined the gods themselves smiling not cruelly, but as if sharing in a small private jest. Inside the sanctuary, barefoot steps echoed differently than leather soles. They seemed softer, more human, less distant. The priests noticed. The scribes who recorded the day's proceedings noted the detail carefully. The pharaoh entered without sandals. They would puzzle over its meaning later, but for now, they wrote the fact down as scribes always did, quietly, faithfully, leaving interpretation to time. At the altar, the pharaoh lifted his foot for a moment, almost absent-mindedly. He thought of the craftsman who had told him earlier that sandals supported balance. Without them, he felt strangely grounded, as if his body leaned more heavily into the floor. The gods, too, had once walked the earth barefoot before sandals were crafted, before reeds were bound into plaited form. The priests sang hymns. The pharaoh closed his eyes and let the voices wash over him. In his mind, sandals became less an absence and more a question. Were they truly needed to be divine, or did divinity grow larger when one dared to stand in simple skin upon stone? Some priests whispered among themselves later that this moment was deeply symbolic. They would compare it to old tales, kings who laid down crowns to show humility, priests who fasted before oracles, gods who disguised themselves as ordinary men. To come without sandals was perhaps to remind all Egypt that greatness need not always glitter. Sometimes greatness walked barefoot. As the ceremony drew to an end, the pharaoh stepped back into the sunlight. Dust clung to his feet. It was a curious thing, even the pharaoh could not escape the dust of the earth. He looked down at his toes, no longer pale from the palace floor, but faintly browned with temple earth. A thought touched him lightly. Dust returns to dust, and even sandals, golden though they might be, are only reeds and leather in the end. The priests and attendants remained uneasy, but the pharaoh himself was calm. He had begun to feel that the disappearance of his sandals was less a theft or mistake than a lesson, though of what exactly he was not yet sure. The sandals of the gods were never truly lost. They were carved into walls, painted on tombs imagined in myths. Perhaps his own sandals had simply gone to join them for a time, spirited away into the invisible realm where stories gather. The procession ended. The pharaoh walked back across the avenue of sphinxes, each step bare, each step unhurried. The stones were warm now from the sun, and the warmth seeped upward into his body through skin and bone, like a memory carried from the earth itself. By the time he returned to the palace, the day felt strangely lighter, as if the absence of sandals had removed some invisible weight. His feet, dusty but unhurt, carried him with surprising ease. Perhaps tomorrow, he thought, the sandals would be found. Or perhaps they would not. For now, he was content to let the mystery remain. And in the silence of the afternoon, Egypt itself seemed to pause. The sandals of a pharaoh were missing, but the world still turned, the Nile still flowed, and the gods from their golden thrones surely watched with quiet amusement. Barefoot in Thebes. The morning sun rose over Thebes like a golden lid sliding open on a vast treasure chest. The wide Nile shimmered with its usual calm, boats drifting lazily on its back as if time itself had slowed to match the river's rhythm. The city, however, was already awake. Donkeys brayed, merchants shouted prices that sounded more like friendly arguments, and children darted through narrow alleys barefoot with the energy of river fish. Among them, strangely out of place yet perfectly serene, walked the pharaoh, not upon a gilded litter carried by sweating servants, not upon a chariot with gleaming wheels. He walked simply and softly, with his royal toes brushing the earth of his capital. His sandals, the ones inlaid with gold threads and papyrus reeds, were still missing. And so the ruler of Egypt, whose name was carved on temple walls to last for eternity, wandered his own city barefoot. At first, the streets of Thebes did not notice, for a king without sandals looked surprisingly ordinary. To a busy baker, he resembled any noble whose servant had forgotten his shoes. To a boy chasing a goat, he looked like another tall man in a linen kilt. Yet little by little, whispers followed him like shadows. The pharaoh walks the streets. The pharaoh has no sandals. He felt no shame. Rather, each step on the cool dust gave him a quiet kind of pleasure. The ground was uneven, warm in patches, and he found himself balancing like a child learning to walk on one foot, then the other. He chuckled inwardly. Perhaps this was how his ancestors felt before shoes were invented, kings barefoot as farmers. Along the avenues he passed the feet of his people, and suddenly the world seemed made entirely of sandals. A fisherman squatted by the riverbank in worn reed slippers that smelled faintly of fish. A noblewoman glided past in delicate leather sandals with red straps that crisscrossed her pale ankles like painted ribbons. Children wore mismatched sandals, too large or too small, borrowed from cousins and neighbors. Some had none at all, and ran freely, their feet tougher than stone. The pharaoh studied these feet with the same reverence his priests studied the stars. He saw in them a map of lives, the cracked heels of workers who built walls, the soft steps of scribes who bent over papyrus all day, the proud stride of a soldier with boots tied tight for marching. Shoes, or the lack of them, told stories more honestly than any scroll. At a corner he stopped before a cobbler's stall. Sandals hung like ripe fruit suspended from cords, rows of papyrus leather, palm fiber, even one pair decorated with beads that glittered in the sun. The cobbler, a wiry man with hands stained dark from oils, looked up nervously. "Great Lord," he stammered, recognizing the face that appeared on every coin and temple statue, "forgive my humble trade." The pharaoh only smiled. "Tell me, how many steps does a sandal last?" The cobbler swallowed, then thought carefully. "It depends, my king. A priest's sandal, soft and unused, might last a lifetime. But a mason's sandal worn against stone may crumble within a season." Then said the pharaoh, "Perhaps sandals measure not wealth, but the kind of road one walks." The cobbler bowed, astonished that the ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt would consider such things. Yet the pharaoh lingered, watching as the man cut strips of leather, pierced holes, and threaded them into straps. It was a rhythm almost musical, the kind of rhythm that held the city together. When he left, the smell of tanned leather clung to his senses, and he realized how much life was woven into every pair of sandals: labor, art, necessity, and even dreams. For some, sandals were freedom. A soldier could march farther, a trader could walk markets without blisters. For others, sandals were status, gilded straps, meant you were seen, respected, remembered. The street opened into the marketplace where voices collided like waves. Here the pharaoh moved more slowly, partly because of the press of bodies, partly because the ground beneath him was littered with stray straw fish scales and a surprising number of dates dropped by careless hands. The soles of his feet told him more than any herald could that today's market was full of figs, that yesterday's fish were still being sold, and that sandals, whether strong or weak, were the thin line between comfort and complaint. He paused before a group of children playing a game with small stones. They looked up wide-eyed, for the pharaoh's face was unmistakable. Yet their attention slid quickly to his bare feet, dusty and vulnerable like theirs. A bold boy whispered, "Even the pharaoh forgets his sandals sometimes." The others giggled. The pharaoh bent down and smiled. "And what is your game?" They showed him hopscotch-like lines scratched into the dust stones tossed and caught mid-step. He tried it once, hopping clumsily on bare feet, his royal balance wobbling. The children laughed, and for the briefest moment Thebes laughed with them, not at the expense of majesty, but in the shared truth that feet, whether royal or poor, stumble alike. As the day stretched, he continued wandering. A procession of priests passed, sandals white as moonlight. A group of workers trudged by with baskets, their sandals barely holding together. A soldier saluted, his sandals wrapped tight with extra cords for strength. Everywhere the pharaoh saw not sandals alone, but the paths they carried, the sweat of temples, the dust of fields, the scars of roads. By late afternoon his feet grew tender, not ruined but softened by years of palace floors and shaded gardens. He welcomed the ache. It was a reminder that the earth still held him, that even a pharaoh could feel the pulse of Thebes through skin and bone. He found shade beneath a sycamore tree and sat quietly. People passed, some bowing, some staring curiously, most simply walking on with their own errands. The pharaoh rubbed his feet and thought perhaps sandals are less possessions and more companions. They bear burdens quietly, they share the heat of the road, and when they are gone, one remembers them not as objects but as witnesses to journeys. Evening drew its curtain across the sky, painting Thebes with indigo and gold. Lamps flickered alive and the marketplace thinned. The pharaoh rose, brushing dust from his legs, and began the walk back toward the palace. His feet were sore, but his heart was oddly light. He had not found his sandals, but he had discovered something gentler, the city itself beneath his toes. When at last he reached the palace gates, servants rushed to meet him with polished sandals prepared. He waved them aside. "Not tonight," he said softly. And so the ruler of Egypt entered his grand halls barefoot, carrying the dust of Thebes like an invisible crown, a memory pressed into skin. That night, as he lay upon linen sheets, the soles of his feet still tingled. He smiled faintly in the darkness. Perhaps tomorrow the missing sandals would appear, perhaps not. For tonight he carried the whole city with him step by step into sleep. Sweetness for a Pharaoh morning in Thebes was already warm, and the Pharaoh awoke to the same mystery as before his sandals were gone. He had almost grown used to it now. Bare feet upon the cool stone had become part of his daily rhythm, a gentle reminder that even kings must feel the ground beneath them. But this morning his thoughts drifted not toward the leather straps or missing buckles, but toward another absence, subtler and more human. It was the absence of sweetness. The Pharaoh, like his people, lived in a land of sun and river, a land that gave bread and beer in abundance, fish from its waters, onions from its soil. These were steady companions, dependable as the turning of the seasons. But sweetness was rarer. To taste something sweet was to taste a blessing, a fleeting spark in the ordinary meal. And so when the sandals could not be found, the Pharaoh decided to follow his bare feet in search of sweetness instead. He walked into the palace storerooms where rows of clay jars were stacked like an army of silent guards. Some contained grain, some beer, some dried fish or figs. He leaned close to one jar, lifted the lid, and inhaled the fragrance of honey. The golden treasure of bees shimmered faintly in the dim light. Honey was not common, but it was revered as food, as medicine, as offering to the gods. To eat honey was to borrow light from the sun itself. The Pharaoh dipped a small reed spoon into the jar and let a droplet fall upon his tongue. Slowly, deliberately, he let it dissolve. Sweetness had a way of slowing time. Even the noise of servants bustling outside the chamber seemed to quiet. For a moment, sandals and power and ceremony were forgotten. There was only sweetness melting like amber upon his tongue. In the courtyards, fruit sellers were beginning to display their baskets. Dates plump and wrinkled, sticky with natural sugar. Figs soft and tender green skin, splitting to reveal pink flesh within. Pomegranates, their ruby seeds glistening like tiny jewels. The Pharaoh paused among them barefoot, unnoticed at first in the morning crowd. A boy offered him a date, not realizing who he was. The Pharaoh accepted it with a smile and bit gently. Dates were the sweetness of the desert, rich enough to satisfy hunger, soft enough to comfort the weary. Soldiers on campaign carried them. Children in villages treasured them as small luxuries. The boy watched the barefoot stranger chew slowly and nodded as if to say, "Yes, it is good." The Pharaoh thought it curious here was a sweetness that crossed every boundary, a fruit for farmer and king alike. Of course, not all sweetness was found in the marketplace. Some was whispered into life in kitchens. There were confections of ground nuts mixed with honey, sticky and filling. There were breads flavored with dates or cakes made for festivals, rich with rare ingredients saved for special days. The Pharaoh remembered a story told by a priest how honey cakes were once set before the statue of a god as if divinity itself might crave dessert. Perhaps gods too longed for sweetness, not only incense, not only solemn chants, but something simple, something human. He imagined with the faintest smile the statue bending low to nibble at a sticky cake, leaving crumbs of eternity upon the altar. The sandals still had not appeared, but the Pharaoh was no longer worried. He felt that the search for sweetness was part of the same journey. Both sandals and sweetness were reminders of what people valued: sandals for protection, sweetness for joy. In the temples, honey was used in mixtures for healing wounds. Priests recorded how bees were creatures of order, their hives small models of cosmic harmony. To taste their gift was to partake in that order. The Pharaoh wondered if losing his sandals had been a lesson to feel the ground, and now to savor the rare sweetness that lifted life above the ordinary. As the day wore on, the pharaoh wandered further following the scents of the market. He passed a table where jars of carob pods were sold. Their flavor was faintly sweet, often ground into drinks for children. He passed another where melons lay in heaps, their pale green flesh glistening with dew. He thought of banquets past where great trays of fruit had been set before guests. And yet he recalled even then the sweetest morsels were the simplest, a ripe fig, a spoonful of honey, a handful of dates. Nobles and commoners alike leaned forward for them, for in sweetness rank mattered little. A barefoot king and a barefoot child might both hold the same piece of fruit and feel the same joy. As the sun began to lower, the pharaoh sat beneath a palm tree by the river bank. A servant, recognizing him at last, rushed forward with sandals in hand, but the pharaoh only waved them away gently. His feet were dusty, his steps slow, but his heart was light. In his lap lay a cluster of grapes, small and round, cool from the shade. He lifted one and placed it on his tongue. Sweetness burst forth, simple and perfect. Perhaps he thought sandals could be lost and found again, but sweetness was always fleeting. It could never be stored long, never captured forever. It had to be savored in its moment like a dream before sleep. That night, when the palace grew quiet, the pharaoh lay awake for a time. The taste of honey still lingered faintly on his lips, and the coolness of figs seemed to rest upon his tongue. He thought of sandals, symbols of order, of journey, of rule. And he thought of sweetness, symbols of joy, of pause, of life's small surprises. The sandals might return tomorrow, or perhaps not. But tonight the pharaoh had sweetness, and that was enough. And with that thought he closed his eyes, drifting slowly into the hush of sleep as the river Nile whispered beyond the walls, and the bees in their hives dreamed of golden light. The pharaoh's hidden herd milked cheese and quiet companions. The pharaoh had grown almost accustomed to the soft touch of the palace stone beneath his bare soles. What began as a curious absence, the sandals that had once guarded his steps, had slowly transformed into a gentle reminder. Sometimes the smallest things vanish, and their absence reveals the world more clearly. That morning, as the Nile carried its lazy light into the courtyards, the pharaoh found himself wandering not toward the bustling halls or shaded gardens, but toward the quieter edges of the palace complex, where the bleating of goats and the low hum of cows stirred in the air. Few thought of pharaohs as men who might pause to notice a goat chewing thoughtfully on a fig leaf, or a cow lowering her head into a wooden trough. Yet here he was, barefoot, robed, brushing the dust, moving slowly among the pens and byres that housed the living storehouse of Egypt's daily strength, its animals. Milk at dawn. A young herdsman knelt beside a cow, his hand steady, his clay jar braced between his knees. Streams of warm milk fell in rhythmic splashes, frothing gently against the jar's edge. The pharaoh paused, the sound soothing like rain drumming on the roof of a reed hut, or the Nile lapping quietly against a boat's side. The herdsman did not look up at once. His task was too focused, too practiced. It was only when the pharaoh's shadow fell across the jar that the boy startled, nearly spilling the milk. "Majesty," he gasped, fumbling to bow, clay jar wobbling dangerously. The pharaoh only smiled. "Do not spill it on my account. Milk is more precious than gold when one is thirsty." The boy, reassured, steadied the jar and continued, though now his movements carried a nervous pride, as though the pharaoh himself had declared milking a noble art. The pharaoh watched, breathing in the earthy sweetness that rose from the cows, the straw, and the fresh milk. Shoes, he thought, could separate one from such scents. Sandals might lift a man above the dust, but bare feet carried him into the heart of it. Cheese and salt. Nearby, a woman bent over a wide reed basket lined with linen. From a clay jar, she poured curdled milk, its soft lumps folding against the cloth. With gentle fingers, she gathered the corners, twisting and tying them so the liquid could drain. It was an old, almost sacred motion, repeated by generations, the birth of cheese. The pharaoh asked softly, "Does it please you, this work?" The woman looked up, surprised to be addressed by her king. "It pleases the stomach, Majesty, and sometimes the tongue." She gave a small smile, wrinkled with humor. He chuckled, and in her plain answer found wisdom. What was more honest than milk curdled into sustenance What was more humble than cheese salted to last through long journeys or lean days? Even pharaohs in their golden tombs were sometimes sent into eternity with a small round of cheese among the treasures, proof that eternity itself might require a bite of comfort. The goat's stubbornness. As he strolled further, the pharaoh noticed a goat attempting to wriggle free from her tether. She had no respect for ceremony nor any reverence for royalty. With a leap, she nearly collided with him, hooves clattering against the stone. The attendants rushed forward, horrified at the sight of goat against pharaoh. But the pharaoh laughed, raising a hand. She is only reminding me that not all creatures bend to crowns and titles. Some live by their own stubborn law. And indeed, the goat, ignoring all fuss, lowered her head to nibble on a fallen date, utterly unimpressed by the grandeur of Egypt. It amused him more than it annoyed him. In truth, it felt almost freeing. Even a pharaoh could be just another man standing before a goat with a mind of her own. Eggs in the basket. A girl carried a woven basket inside which nestled a dozen eggs, each fragile as the moon's reflection on water. She placed them carefully in the shade, bowing deeply. The pharaoh peered at them as though they were jewels. So easily broken, yet so filled with promise, he murmured. He thought of sandals again, crafted to endure the dust, protect the flesh, and travel many miles. Eggs were their opposite, so breakable yet containing life itself. How curious, he thought, that the palace needed both sandals to guard the journey, eggs to remind of fragility. A quiet bond. The animals shifted and murmured tales, swishing hooves, stamping softly. There was no grandeur here, no fanfare of trumpets or procession of priests. Only the living heartbeat of Egypt's food pulsing gently in the pens and baskets, and jars of milk and rounds of cheese, and the warmth of eggs waiting to be eaten. The pharaoh felt a strange companionship with them. His sandals might be gone, but his bare feet felt closer to the straw and soil that nourished both man and beast. He reached out, laying a hand on the cow's broad back. Its hide was warm beneath his palm, steady with life. For a moment, the pharaoh was not the master of Egypt, but simply another creature among creatures, needing milk, needing food, needing the quiet comfort that living things gave one another. Reflections at dusk. By the time the sun slanted low and the shadows stretched across the pens, the pharaoh's attendants had grown restless. They worried about his dignity, about the dust on his bare feet, about the goat that had nearly toppled him. But he himself felt no worry. He had not found his missing sandals, but he had discovered something softer, the reminder that even pharaohs walk beside cows and goats, share bread with cheese, and drink milk when thirsty. Greatness was not always in gold. Sometimes it was in a jar of milk frothy at dawn. That night, as he lay on his couch, the pharaoh thought not of thrones or temples, but of the steady rhythm of the herdsman's hands, the soft draining of cheese in linen, the stubborn goat, and the fragile eggs. He drifted into sleep with the sense that his missing sandals had not robbed him of dignity, but had gifted him something far rarer, closeness to the quiet companions of life. And so, barefoot still, the pharaoh dreamed of cows, lowing goats chewing, and milk spilling gently into a clay jar, dreams humble enough to be eternal. A pinch of flavor. The pharaoh woke again to the familiar absence at his bedside. No sandals, no gilded straps, no soft soles embroidered with divine symbols. Just the bare pads of his feet pressed against the smooth, cool stone of his chamber floor. By now the pharaoh was beginning to expect it. Each morning had opened with the same mystery, and instead of alarm, he found himself strangely curious. What did it mean to walk through the world barefoot? What did it mean to be stripped of adornment and to taste life as it was, without ornament? That thought taste lingered with him as he rose. He recalled the evening meal from the night before, bread, beer, perhaps a handful of figs, plain, nourishing, but almost without surprise. Without his sandals, perhaps his senses had sharpened, for he found himself longing not for meat or for feasts, but for something smaller, something that could wake the tongue the way a splash of cool water wakes the face, a pinch of flavor. The kitchens of the palace were never quiet. Even in the stillness before dawn, servants stirred pots of lentils and barley ground flour at the great stone querns and stoked fires that left the walls blackened with smoke. But this morning the pharaoh moved among them silently, barefoot, unnoticed for a time, as if he were no more than a humble guest wandering through the heart of a busy household. He watched a cook reach for a bundle of dried coriander leaves, crushing them between her fingers. The scent rose into the air, green peppery, almost sharp. Another servant sprinkled salt crystals into a stew, their whiteness catching the glow of the firelight. A boy leaned over a basket of onions, their pungency filling the corners of the room like an invisible fog. None of these were the grand imports of caravans from distant lands. No cinnamon from Punt, no pepper from India, no saffron, no myrrh to flavor wine. These were humbler local things, herbs plucked from the palace garden, reeds, dried along the riverbank, salt carried from the desert, onions pulled from the earth. And yet how alive they seemed. The pharaoh remembered the sandals he once wore and how they were never only leather and reed. They carried symbols, a falcon for Horus, a lotus for Upper Egypt, a papyrus stem for Lower Egypt. The smallest decoration made them not just shoes but statements. So too with food. A stew of beans and barley might fill the stomach, but without a pinch of salt, a twist of coriander, or a bite of onion, it was only silence. With them it became a song. He asked the chief cook, who bowed so low her forehead almost touched the stone floor, "Tell me, what is the worth of these herbs and grains you add by hand?" The cook looked startled, for Pharaoh rarely inquired about the kitchens. But finding his tone gentle, she answered carefully, "My lord, without them food fills the belly but not the spirit. Salt preserves, herbs awaken. Even the poorest man can make a crust of bread taste richer if he has an onion by his side." The pharaoh smiled, a pinch of truth in her words as well as a pinch of flavor. Later that day, the pharaoh walked out to the palace gardens, still barefoot. There he saw the orderly rows of herbs growing under the watch of temple gardeners. Sage, mint, dill, and parsley, all tended like children. Bees hummed nearby, attracted by blossoms whose scents mingled faintly in the air. A priest of the temple gardens approached, bowing, and spoke of how herbs healed as well as flavored. Mint soothed the stomach, garlic gave strength, cumin helped the breath. The pharaoh listened as though he were a pupil, not a king, learning how the earth provided not only sustenance, but also small joys that brightened the dullness of daily fare. He thought of sandals again. They protected the foot, yes, but they also carried signs, marks of identity, power, hope. Herbs and seasonings did the same for food. A stew with sage whispered of care. Bread with salt declared welcome. Even the onion, so simple, so common, could transform a laborer's lunch into something worthy of memory. As the day waned, the pharaoh returned to his hall. A tray was brought before him, plain bread, a bowl of lentils, and beside them a tiny dish of herbs. He pinched some between his fingers and brought them to his lips. The taste was strong, almost startling, and then it faded, leaving behind warmth, memory, and a curious longing for more. It was like the sandals. Their absence startled him at first, but then their memory lingered, shaping each step he took upon the earth. The pharaoh ate slowly, with the patience of one savoring not the food itself, but the meaning hidden within it. That night before sleep, he reflected, perhaps sandals were to the body what spices were to food, not necessary for survival, yet impossible to forget. A reed mat could be walked upon barefoot. A plain bowl of beans could be eaten unseasoned. But sandals turned walking into dignity, and spices turned eating into delight. As the stars rose above the darkened palace, the pharaoh finally lay down to rest. His feet still bare curled upon the cool stone. His belly, full but not heavy, carried the memory of herbs and salt. And his mind, drifting toward sleep, wandered between sandals and spices, both small, both fragile, and both reminders that even the simplest things carried the power to transform. Scarcity at the gates. The palace that once seemed filled with endless provisions now felt in its silence as though it were holding its breath. The pharaoh, still barefoot from his missing sandals, walked across cool flagstones that echoed with a faint hollowness, as though the absence of leather on stone mirrored the absence of grain in the bins. Egypt was not always overflowing. The Nile, generous in most years, had its moods. A low flood meant thin harvests, and thin harvests meant stomachs that grumbled in unison from peasant huts to the gilded halls of the palace. Scarcity, like a shadow, could fall across every threshold. The pharaoh paused at a granary, its great wooden doors standing open. He stepped inside, his bare soles brushing against scattered kernels on the floor. Where once heaps of barley and wheat would have risen like golden hills, only shallow mounds remained. Workers with hollow cheeks carried baskets, half-filled their movements, careful as though each grain of wheat carried the weight of gold. Even sandals wear thin when the land grows lean. The overseer muttered softly, bowing low. The pharaoh thought of his missing sandals. Perhaps their disappearance had been an omen warning of days when the earth itself seemed unwilling to clothe its people fully. Just as he walked unshod, so too did the land walk, half-covered its fields, patchy, its baskets lighter than they should be. That night the kitchen served a thinner stew. The broth was clear, the vegetables cut small, and the bread at his side was hard enough to knock against the rim of the bowl. Yet even in this there was a kind of quiet resilience. The cooks flavored the broth with herbs from the palace garden, parsley, coriander, mint, turning scarcity into something that still smelled inviting, still warmed the body. The pharaoh ate slowly. The squire beside him, a young boy with bright but anxious eyes, whispered, "My lord, the stew is watery tonight." The pharaoh smiled faintly. "Then it is like the river itself, clear and flowing. Drink, and it will carry us through." There was silence after that, but it was a companionable silence. Hunger was not new to Egypt. Generations had faced thin years. Some had lived through famine so dire that dried fish bones were ground into flour and lotus roots scraped from the marshes became bread. Compared to such times, this was but a whisper of want. Still, the whisper carried far, curling into every corner of the land. Later, as he lay on his couch, the pharaoh thought of sieges, those stories from the past, when enemies camped at the gates of a city, cutting off trade and water. Inside, people boiled leather straps, chewed reeds, and prayed for mercy. Hunger under siege was sharp, merciless, and unrelenting. Hunger in a palace granary, by contrast, was softer, gentler, but hunger nonetheless. Barefoot, he curled his toes against the woven mat. The missing sandals had become more than leather and reed. They were a measure of plenty, of dignity, of comfort. Without them, he felt the edge of every stone. Without grain, his people felt the edge of every day. And yet, as the lamps dimmed and the palace settled into quiet, the pharaoh closed his eyes, not in despair, but in trust. Scarcity came like seasons, but so too did abundance. Sandals wore out, but new ones could be woven. The Nile might falter, but it always returned bearing silt and promise. The pharaoh drifted toward sleep with these thoughts, the absence of his sandals a small echo of the greater absences of the land. But in both he sensed not only loss, but a reminder to notice the simple things when they are present, to hold them gently, and to remember that even in times of little, life continues one barefoot step at a time. The feast after fasting. The palace had grown used to quiet meals. For several days now, the pharaoh had walked the halls with unshod feet and a lighter stomach, as if both his sandals and the abundance of the kitchen had gone missing together. His sandals remained lost, and the storerooms had been lean, but tonight there was a stir in the air, something different, something almost festive. The servants whispered while carrying trays. Cooks bustled with a kind of restrained excitement. The smell of roasting spiced meat drifted softly into the corridors. After days of thin porridge and watered beer, after days of honey stretched thin across too much bread, the palace was preparing for a feast. The pharaoh, barefoot, as always, paused at the entrance to the great hall. He could feel the cool stone beneath his toes, smoothed by generations of footsteps. He wondered briefly if the stone itself remembered the difference between an ordinary day and a feast day. Perhaps it did, for the stone seemed almost to hum with anticipation, as if waiting for music and laughter. Inside, the hall flickered with lamplight. Platters were being set on long tables, pyramids of dates, gleaming fish baked in clay bread loaves, still crackling from the oven, and the heavy centerpiece of the evening, a roasted goose, its skin glazed until golden, promising richness after so much simplicity. The aroma was warm and dizzying, like a welcome after a long journey. The pharaoh took his seat, though without sandals. He felt almost like a guest in his own hall. Around him, nobles, priests, and generals murmured, their own hunger softened by the promise of plenty. They too had endured the season of lean rations. Now they too looked upon the tables as if beholding a miracle. A priest rose first to speak a blessing. His words were steady but tinged with gratitude. He spoke of the Nile's return of harvests to come, of the gods' favor and cycles of emptiness and abundance. The pharaoh listened closely, his bare feet tucked beneath him. He thought of how sandals, once on his feet, lifted him slightly from the ground, but tonight, shoeless, he felt closer to the earth. The earth, he thought, knew hunger and fullness both. At a signal, servants began to pour wine and beer, filling cups to their brims. A hum of voices grew louder, steadier, like a chorus remembering its lines. Platters moved from hand to hand, the goose carved carefully, each slice passed down the tables. The pharaoh took his portion slowly, his fingers brushing the warm bread, the tender meat. How strange, he reflected, how quickly one could forget the taste of plenty. After just a few days of fasting, forced perhaps, but fasting all the same, this feast seemed enormous, overwhelming, almost too much. Yet it was not only his stomach that filled. Something in his heart expanded too. He noticed his generals smiling more than usual. He noticed the priests lingering over figs as though savoring visions of paradise. Even the youngest servants, usually silent, laughed softly between themselves when they thought no one was watching. The feast was not simply food. It was proof that emptiness did not last forever. The pharaoh lifted his cup. The wine was dark and slightly sharp, reminding him of the sandals he had once worn, for rituals beautiful, decorated, but sometimes uncomfortable. The goose, on the other hand, was tender and rich, more like the worn sandals of his childhood's simple leather that carried him across dusty courtyards. Strange, he thought, how everything reminded him of sandals, now abundance and absence, sweetness and sharpness, the fullness of life and its leaner days. He ate slowly, as though to stretch each bite across eternity. The roasted fish reminded him of riverbanks filled with children playing. The dates recalled orchards where farmers laughed in the sun. Even the bread, ordinary bread, which in leaner days had seemed too dry, now tasted like a gift. As the night deepened, musicians played soft notes, and the feast settled into a rhythm, laughter, clinking cups, stories told and retold. The pharaoh leaned back barefoot under the table. His belly no longer hollow, his mind no longer heavy with want. And yet he did not forget. He thought of the days just past, when the bowls had been nearly empty and sandals nearly forgotten. He thought of how hunger had sharpened, not only the appetite, but also the sense of gratitude. He thought of how walking barefoot had made him notice the ground itself, the dust, the coolness of stone, the roughness of reed mats. Perhaps, he mused, sandals were like feasts. When one always wore them, one forgot the feel of the earth. When one always feasted, one forgot the taste of bread. Loss, in its quiet way, was a kind of tutor. At last, the feast wound down. Candles guttered, laughter softened to murmurs, and servants began clearing platters now reduced to crumbs and bones. The pharaoh rose slowly. His feet touched the cool floor once more. The wine lingered in his veins, the goose in his stomach, but it was the sense of balance that warmed him most. Fasting and feasting absence, and abundant sandals lost, and sandals remembered. He walked back to his chamber with bare steps echoing softly in the corridor. Tonight he would sleep well, full and content, but mindful of the lesson hidden in the space between hunger and plenty. And though his sandals remained lost, the pharaoh felt strangely at peace, as though he had gained something greater than leather or gold, the knowledge that every feast is sweetest when it follows fasting, and every step most precious when taken with bare feet. Walking beyond the walls. The sun had only just begun to warm the white walls of the palace when the pharaoh stirred barefoot once again, as he had been for many days now. The sandals of gold and leather, those missing shoes that had once been his pride and symbol, remained nowhere to be found. Yet he had grown used to their absence. What had started as a small inconvenience had now become a quiet companion, a reminder that even a pharaoh could tread the earth in the same way as any man, without cushion or ornament. That morning he chose to leave the palace. Not in procession, not in ceremony, but in the simple way one does when the walls feel too close. His guards followed at a respectful distance, whispering among themselves, puzzled but obedient. The pharaoh walked, his soles pressing against cool stone steps, then against the dry sand of the path that led beyond the gates of Thebes. The city faded behind him as the fields opened wide. The Nile glimmered in the distance, a slow silver ribbon winding through green banks. Farmers were already at work, bending low to guide oxen or scattering seed into dark soil. Their sandals were crude things, braided reeds, sometimes little more than tough strips of papyrus bound around the feet. Some worked barefoot entirely, their toes thick with callus, their heels hardened by years of labor. The pharaoh watched with quiet fascination. How different their steps were from his own. Where his unaccustomed feet felt each pebble sharply, the farmers walked as though the land were a familiar blanket, their souls so strong they scarcely noticed the earth's roughness. As he passed, they bowed, surprised to see the ruler of the two lands striding plainly on their path, dust coating his ankles. But the pharaoh only smiled faintly and waved them back to their work. He was not there to command, he was there to walk. The path took him further, where shepherd boys guided flocks of goats and sheep toward patches of scrubby grass. The animals trotted easily, hooves clicking over the stones. One curious goat stopped to sniff at the pharaoh's bare toes, and the shepherd blushed deeply, tugging it back. Yet the pharaoh laughed softly, stroking its head before moving on. Everywhere he went, he noticed the same things: sandals, shoes, or the lack of them. Each pair told a story. The merchant on the road wore sturdy leather sandals, patched many times over, proof of countless journeys to distant markets. A fisherman by the river had only rough plaited reeds on his feet, softened by water and sand. And a child ran barefoot past him, laughing freely, her steps light and unbothered by the stones that troubled his royal feet. The pharaoh thought then of his missing sandals. Perhaps they were not lost at all. Perhaps they had simply returned to the earth to join the thousands of humble shoes that bore the weight of lives more ordinary than his own. His golden sandals had been symbols, yes, but perhaps they were also a burden, a reminder that he was separate, raised above. Without them, he felt closer to these people. He felt each step as they did, plain, simple, real. By midday, the sun burned hot overhead. The earth beneath his feet grew warm, even harsh, and the pharaoh slowed. His guards offered to carry him back, but he shook his head. Instead, he sat on a low stone by the roadside and let his feet rest in the dust. A woman carrying baskets paused to offer him a strip of cloth. He accepted it, wrapping it loosely around one foot, then the other. Not a sandal, not truly, but enough to soften the ground beneath him. He thanked her with a nod. She smiled, shyly bowed, and moved on her own worn sandals, slapping quietly against the path. As the pharaoh resumed walking, he thought of the many kinds of journeys that feet make: journeys of toil, of trade, of pilgrimage. His own had been journeys of rule and ritual, yet now they had become something else, a wandering, almost aimless, yet deeply human. The sandals might never be found, and perhaps that was the point. In losing them, he had gained something subtler, an awareness of what it was to be simply a man walking upon the earth, to feel the dust cling, to notice the stories of every footstep around him. By the time he returned to the palace, the sky had begun to soften with evening light. His soles were tired, tingling from the day's long path, but his heart was strangely light. He had walked beyond the walls, and in doing so he had stepped, if only for a while, into the lives of his people. The sandals were still gone, yet the pharaoh no longer longed for them as he once had. The ground itself had become his companion, steady beneath his feet, carrying him forward one quiet step at a time. And as night fell, he lay down to rest, the memory of the road still warm against his skin. Sleep came gently, like dust settling after a day's long journey. Bread in the temple kitchen. The pharaoh, still barefoot, woke with the sound of doves cooing softly in the courtyard. He was getting used to the quiet feel of cool stone beneath his feet. It no longer felt like loss, but almost like a companion, an unexpected friend who had chosen to follow him. The sandals were still missing, and by now he knew they might remain gone forever, or return on some day when he no longer thought about them. That morning he wandered toward the temple kitchens. He had passed by them many times, but rarely stepped inside. A pharaoh was usually expected to eat in marble halls, with dishes carried out by servants on polished trays. But the pharaoh, curious and a little hungry, thought he might learn more about food if he saw where it was truly made in the heat and smoke and laughter of a kitchen. The temple kitchens were alive with sound, mortar and pestle grinding clay pots, rattling wooden spoons, stirring laughter rising in the low hum of cooks who sang to themselves while kneading bread. The pharaoh stepped across the threshold, his bare soles touching the well-worn floor smoothed by centuries of footsteps. He felt he was stepping into the heart of his city. The cooks looked up in surprise when they saw him. One nearly dropped her basket of onions, another quickly tried to brush flour off her face. But the pharaoh only smiled. "I came not to command," he said softly, "but to learn how bread becomes bread." At that, the tension melted. A few laughed nervously, then offered him a stool, though he preferred to stand. He leaned against a pillar and watched. There was something deeply peaceful about the rhythm of their work. Grain poured into bowls, water splashed. Dough was pressed, stretched, folded, left to rest, and then baked into fragrant loaves. Some loaves were plain for daily hunger. Others were plated or stamped with little symbols meant for offerings to the gods. The pharaoh marveled at how a single handful of flour could become either humble food or holy ritual, depending only on the hands that shaped it. One cook, noticing his interest, held out a lump of dough. "Would your majesty like to try?" The pharaoh chuckled. "If the gods will forgive me for kneading with royal fingers." He pressed the dough clumsily, his bare toes gripping the stone floor as if balancing him in this new, unfamiliar task. The dough resisted at first, then yielded warm and alive beneath his palms. He laughed quietly at how sticky his fingers became. The cooks laughed too, but not unkindly. There was something endearing in seeing the ruler of the two lands covered in flour. They spoke of bread while they worked. Bread for soldiers on long marches. Bread baked dry and hard so it could travel far. Bread for workers building temples coarse and filling. Bread for the rich, soft and light, touched with honey. Bread for the dead tucked into tombs so the departed might never go hungry. Bread, they said, was life itself, grain reborn, as sustenance sun captured in edible form. The pharaoh listened as though hearing poetry, and sandals, he said at last, are to walking what bread is to hunger. One protects the body, the other fills it. Both are made by patient hands. The cooks nodded, seeing the connection. One of them told a story of how her grandmother used to bake bread barefoot, believing the earth flowed up through her soles and into the dough. The pharaoh thought about that as he shifted his feet, dusting them with flour as if marking his steps in the kitchen forever. When the first loaves came out of the oven, their fragrance filled the room. Warm, nutty, comforting. The pharaoh tasted one still steaming, and for a moment all the duties of kingship fell away. He was only a man eating bread surrounded by people who fed both gods and mortals alike. He lingered there long after the priests expected him back. The cooks spoke to him not as a distant ruler, but as someone who had shared their labor, if only for a moment. They told him of shortages and abundance of the patience bread demanded, and how every loaf carried a memory of sun water and human care. At last, when the day waned and the ovens cooled, the pharaoh stood to leave. His feet, still bare, were dusted white with flour. It looked almost as if he had walked through snow, though he had never seen snow in his life. He smiled at the sight. "Perhaps sandals may vanish," he said quietly to himself, "but bread will never abandon us." And with that, he returned to his chambers carrying a simple round loaf wrapped in linen, a gift from the kitchen. That night he ate it slowly, each bite a small prayer of gratitude. And as he drifted to sleep, he wondered perhaps losing sandals was not a curse, but a way of learning to walk into hidden places like kitchens, where the true life of his kingdom was waiting. The drink of the living morning light spilled softly into the palace, filtering through carved screens of stone, painting quiet patterns on the floor where the pharaoh walked barefoot. The sandals were still missing. Days had passed, chapters of thought had unfolded, and still there was no sign of them, no golden strap peeking from beneath a chest, no polished leather tucked against a column. The absence had ceased to sting. It had become instead a companion. Just as one learns to walk beside the shadow cast by the sun, so too had the pharaoh learned to walk beside his vanished sandals. He carried them in memory now, even as his feet pressed directly against the cool flagstones. This morning, however, his thoughts turned to thirst. Bread had been pondered, tasted, and broken in kitchens fragrant with wheat. Spices had been sniffed, their invisible powers noted. Even scarcity and plenty had played their games across the tables of Thebes. But what was bread without water, or honey without the drink that softens its sweetness? What was the feast of life without something to sip and swallow to refresh the mouth and loosen the heart? The Pharaoh smiled to himself. Today it seemed was a day to consider drink. The brewery courtyard. He walked into the palace's brewery courtyard where the air smelled faintly of damp grain and faintly too of yesterday's laughter. Rows of clay jars leaned against walls, and women with long hair bound in linen bands stirred thick mixtures with wooden paddles. Beer, the Pharaoh thought, was a river in itself. Brown, foamy, nourishing. More food than drink, really, but beloved by farmers' guards and priests alike. Beer is bread you can sip, one brewer said shyly when the Pharaoh asked her what it meant. She held up her paddle like a scepter. It fills the belly when there is no meat, and it gladdens the tongue when there is no honey. The Pharaoh nodded, amused. And what of sandals he asked for, he could not resist. She laughed, not daring to answer, though the thought was clear enough. Sandals carried the body forward. Beer carried the spirit along. The pressing of grapes. Later, the Pharaoh walked beyond the brewery to the palace vineyard. There boys and men pressed grapes in shallow vats, their bare feet purple, sticky, and joyous. He watched them stomp in rhythm, a music of splashing juice and muffled laughter rising into the sunlit air. Wine was different from beer. Beer was the food of many. Wine was the song of a few. It traveled slowly in amphorae, wrapped and sealed, guarded carefully like a secret meant to be savored, rather than shared too widely. The Pharaoh dipped his finger into the first drips of juice, tart and sharp against his tongue. Wine was a thing of patience, waiting months or years in darkness before it revealed itself. Sandals, too, he thought, had patience. They bore the dust of many journeys, kept their shape through time, and only showed their wear when the leather thinned. Perhaps sandals and wine were kin, both spoke of endurance of the long road rather than the quick delight. Water from the Nile. At dusk, the Pharaoh wandered down to the river bank. The Nile moved at its steady pace, neither hurried nor still, carrying reflections of the evening sky. He cupped his hands and lifted water to his lips. Cool, simple, unadorned. Water was the oldest drink, the quiet parent of all others. No fermenting jars, no pressing feet, no brewing fires. Just the gift of the river flowing in and out day after day without ornament. He thought of sandals again. Perhaps water was like bare feet, direct, unmediated, needing nothing. Sandals were wine sandals, were beer worked, crafted, flavored by human hands. But water was different. Water was earth itself, touching skin to stone, refreshing without disguise. And so the Pharaoh found a peculiar peace in standing barefoot beside the Nile, drinking the same water that his ancestors had sipped, the same water that the sandals had once carried him to. Reflections by moonlight. That night the palace grew quiet. The last jars of beer were sealed, the vineyards dark, the river gleaming under a slice of moon. The Pharaoh lay awake on his couch, toes free against woven linen, and thought about drink. Beer, wine, water, each a way of meeting life. Sandals, bare feet, each a way of meeting the earth. The sandals were still gone, but drink reminded him that absence was not emptiness. Beer was bread transformed, wine was grapes transformed, water was sky transformed into river. Sandals, too, might return in another form, perhaps not as leather and gold, but as lessons, as laughter, as the simple knowledge that feet can be both bound and free. He smiled in the darkness, tasting faintly on his tongue the sweetness of grapes, the bitterness of barley, the clarity of river water. His sandals had walked far wherever they were. His feet remained here at rest. And slowly, peacefully, the barefoot Pharaoh drifted into dreams, where vineyards stretched endlessly, where the Nile sang, and where sandals walked beside him, neither lost nor found, but simply present in the flow of the world. The music of bare feet. The day was cooling. In the courtyards of the palace, shadows lengthened like stretched ribbons, softening the stones. Pharaoh, still without his golden sandals, let his bare soles rest on the flagstones, which were warm, but not hot, now smooth in places and slightly rough in others. He could feel in his own body the rhythm of a day drawing to its gentle close. That evening was a time of festival, not a grand feast with offerings and sacrifices, nor a solemn ceremony in the temple, but one of those quieter palace evenings when music, dance, and laughter were permitted to flow through the air like incense. The musicians had gathered their instruments, polished and tuned harps strung tight, lutes humming softly under fingertips, and flutes ready to carry thin silver notes into the night. Pharaoh entered the hall without sandals, and though some attendants whispered with embarrassment how strange a ruler barefoot among his court, the pharaoh himself felt oddly at home. The absence of his sandals by now was like a companion always there, always reminding him of something more than a loss. He took his seat not on the throne but on a simple low bench of cedar. When the first notes began to rise, he closed his eyes. The harp trembled gently, the drum beat a patient, steady rhythm like a heartbeat, and the rattling of sistra added sparkle, as if the stars themselves had been shaken loose into sound. The dancers entered. They stepped lightly, their anklets chiming their own feet, bare, of course, striking the floor in patterns that matched the drums. Pharaoh noticed the dust lifting from the tiles as the dancers moved, faint little puffs that caught the torchlight. Each dancer's footfall reminded him of his own padding across palace corridors, temple stones, and city streets since the disappearance of his sandals. He thought sandals soften the step, but bare feet carry the truth of rhythm. As the music swirled, he found himself tapping his toes against the stone. It amused him that a pharaoh's bare toes could keep time just as well as those of a shepherd or a child. He looked down and saw his nails catching a glimmer of light. His skin hardened slightly from these days without sandals. He imagined that the rhythm of his feet, simple and unadorned, was another kind of music in itself. The singers began to chant, their voices weaving praise for life, for harvests, for love, for the Nile. Their words rose high, then dipped low, circling like birds in flight. And in their song, Pharaoh almost thought he heard mention of sandals, not golden ones, not royal ones, but the common sandals of men and women walking to fields or markets. It was not truly in the words, but in the feeling, a recognition that all lifelike music was measured in steps and beats, in the quiet tread of many feet upon the earth. The dancers spun faster now, skirts fanning, anklets rattling. Pharaoh smiled, for the sound was like laughter made of metal. He remembered suddenly that sandals could never quite do this. Sandals might shine, sandals might dignify, but they muffled the true percussion of feet against stone. It struck him gently like a passing breeze. Perhaps sandals were not missing at all, but simply waiting in silence, giving space for him to hear something he never would have noticed otherwise, the music of bare feet. The hall filled with clapping hands. Pharaoh clapped too slowly, his palms soft against each other. The musicians bowed. The dancers lowered themselves gracefully, and the festival began to dissolve into talk and laughter. But Pharaoh remained still, listening long after the instruments had ceased. He thought of the sandals, wherever they might be hidden in some dusty corner of the palace, spirited away by mischievous servants, or taken by the gods themselves. Their absence no longer pressed on him like a riddle. Instead, it had become like a pause in music, a silence that lets one hear the next note more clearly. As the torches flickered low and the hall emptied, Pharaoh stood and walked barefoot back to his chamber. The stones were cool now, and each step seemed to carry with it a soft echo of the evening's rhythm. He smiled faintly. The sandals were still gone, yes, but his feet, unadorned, had found their own song. That night, when he lay down to rest, the music lingered not as sound, but as a feeling in his soles, in his breath, in the hush between heartbeats. Sleep took him gently, as though rocking him in time to a rhythm older than sandals, older than kings, older than stone itself. The sandals that were never lost. The palace had grown quiet. Evening lamps flickered against painted walls, their flames bending and bowing in the faint breeze that wandered through open courtyards. The great city of Thebes murmured outside, its noise softened by distance, a donkey's bray, the faint splash of water being poured from jar to jar, the laughter of a family finishing their supper. Pharaoh sat alone on a low stone bench in the garden. The earth beneath his feet was cool now, no longer burning from the sun of the day. He pressed his bare toes into the soil and felt the firmness of the ground receive him as if the earth itself were a sandal large enough to cradle even a king. The golden sandals had never returned. Days had become weeks and weeks a season. Courtiers had searched, priests had prayed, artisans had sworn they could craft replacements finer than the originals. Yet Pharaoh had waved away their worry. What was once strange, even alarming, the absence of those jeweled shoes, had softened into something else, a lesson that walked with him. He thought of all he had seen since that morning when his feet had been left uncovered. The cobblers and craftsmen, each speaking with pride of their skills. The priests in their temples who whispered that to walk barefoot before the gods was the truest form of reverence. The markets of Thebes alive with the shuffle of thousands of ordinary feet. The sweet taste of honey and figs, the milk of cows and goats, the herbs that gave food its fragrance, the beer and wine that sustained joy, the bread that was holy. Even the silence of hunger and the laughter of music. All of it, he realized, had been walked into more deeply because he had walked it barefoot. The sandals had been symbols of his office, decorated with gold, bright with inlays, reminders of majesty. Yet without them, he had found something humbler, but no less grand. His steps no longer hovered above the dust, they mingled with it. His footprints were the same shape as those of his people, whether farmer or soldier, child or priest. Perhaps he thought that was the secret. The sandals had not been stolen. They had been given away not to any single person, but to everyone, to the soil that fed the crops, to the stones of the palace floor, to the cool river banks and the temple thresholds, to the music of dancers and the kitchens of bakers. They were not lost. They had simply changed form. A gentle breeze stirred the papyrus reeds, making them whisper as if agreeing. Pharaoh closed his eyes. He pictured his sandals walking still, not on his feet, but in all the places he had gone, carried in memory, in stories, in the laughter of cobblers, in the prayers of priests, in the bread of the poor. It was enough. Slowly he rose from the bench. The earth clung faintly to his soles, a last gift of the day. He walked back toward the palace, his steps soundless, steady, unhurried. His attendants bowed, some with sandals on their feet, some without. Pharaoh smiled at them all. That night, before lying down to rest, he looked once more at the place where his sandals had once been kept. The stand was empty, but it no longer seemed bare. Instead, it seemed full of meaning, of memory, of journeys both made and still to come. He lay down, and with the calm of someone who has nothing missing, he closed his eyes. And so the Pharaoh who had begun barefoot by chance remained barefoot by choice.